This is Niswander, and welcome to the Nowman show. And for those of you watching on YouTube live, welcome. And in this segment, we're having a panel discussion. We're going to be focusing on envisioning a world of left politics and economics. We're going to be talking mostly about solutions to the immense problems that we have in this world today, with some of the brightest minds that have been on this show. First of all, Matt Snyder and Jesse Herring, who are the creators and the hosts of a podcast called The Future Is A Mixtape, and which is a podcast about that very subject, imagining what the world would look like in a utopian sense. And then also with me is my associate from Arete Media Productions, our political analyst for the Nowman show, George Kallas, Professor George Kallas from San Diego. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on the show.
Yep, absolutely.
Let's get right into this. I do want to briefly, for those of you who might know the word utopia, utopian. Now, there's a great group of Todd Rundgren called Utopia, but we're not talking about that, right? We're talking about Sir Thomas More's book, right?
It was in 1516.
Wow.
So we just celebrated, the 500th year anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia. And actually at UC Riverside, we have the largest collection of utopian and space and science fiction.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at the Riverside Library at UC Riverside. So we have a huge collection, and we actually have one of the original copies of Utopia there.
Oh, really?
So it's extremely beautiful. And there's
from 1516?
Yeah, from 1516.
Wow.
And it basically, it was part of a museum gallery showing to celebrate that 500th year.
Sir Thomas More.
Yeah, and so the term utopia, if you look at the actual Latin expressions with it, it means nowhere or no place. But it's also a play or a pun because it has the sound oo, so it sounds like euphemism or good. So it can also indicate in a punny sense the idea of a good place. And so there's that tension with the term. And much of the scholarship on the book is about whether or not Thomas More is being satiric, or whether he was being sincere in many of the parts of the book, because there's obviously utopian aspects and very dystopian aspects with it. And it becomes part of this burgeoning subgenre called utopian science fiction. And it's often schematic. So a lot of utopian science fiction often has a traveler who's coming back and telling people about this strange world or strange land. And that's a kind of element in science fiction is what you call the philosophical tradition. A microcosmos by Voltaire is also an example of that. These kind of like micro communities, and then people come back and talk about, as they're traveling, of this utopian sphere. Herland by Gilman Perkins is another example of a utopian fiction where women have an entire society that's governed by women. There's no men in existence. An earthquake breaks them off from men, and they can actually reproduce other women. And it's a matriarchal utopia. So those are some of those kinds of experiments. But Sir Thomas More is considered the beginning of this kind of subgenre. It's been kind of absent from science fiction until quite recently, until the 1970s.
Oh, really? Wow, that's interesting to know. Wow, you are certainly an expert there. Are you one of the contributors to that collection?
No, but I did a class at UC Riverside called Utopia Dystopia. So the first 5 weeks, I depressed the hell out of my students, and the next 5 weeks we read utopian novels or books. So I lifted them out of the trenches. And so it was a way of examining, I think, and also correction to the kind of huge engorgement on dystopian science fiction, that we're really being engorged by dystopian thought and dystopian writing, and it's a cheap kind of answer. And it's a debate within the science fiction community about whether or not they should go back to having those broader visions. There's a book called Hieroglyph that's part of a hieroglyph project by Neil Stevenson, and they're trying to create science fiction that's positive and provides a better future rather than dystopian future. And right now it sells books, it sells movies, but we're being drenched in it, and it's a problem.
Yeah, we are in what we've titled one of our episodes in this terminal dystopia syndrome. We have this addiction to stories about the end of the world, and as the common adage goes, it's easier to imagine than the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Frederick Jameson.
Well, it isn't for me, but
well, not for us. Neither for us, and that's why in our project, this particular collaboration, this podcast that we produce, the Future Is A Mixtape, we are overtly utopian. We are not, as in contrast to the conventional centrist left, the common democratic narratives that are afraid of utopia, right? So the reformists are afraid of utopia because we can't, it's not achievable. Well, we've seen what happens when we don't offer visions for a better world, and so that's where we're going to talk about solutions. That's what we're really invested in, is talking about a vision for a better world. What are solutions to help us get there?
Well, one of the things that we have seen with capitalism is the growth of the fossil fuel industry. And now we have a crisis, an environmental crisis, like probably has never been seen in the history of this planet. So, and I mean, all the data is out there. I mean, I've had people on this show. I mean, it's not debatable anymore.
If we survive this century, they'll do a ranking of mass murders. Exxon will be at the top of the list. We're locked into mass death right now. So when the Trump election occurred, right, Trumpster fire started, I could see Florida turn red, and I was actually seeing the color blue because Florida's going to be underwater. It's locked.
That's right.
It's locked in. No matter what we do, half of Florida's underwater.
And a lot of these South Pacific islands probably as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So what is the solution there? I mean, if there is a solution, what is it?
Democratic socialism, at least initially, as a kind of the kind of infrastructure projects as well as reparation. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, talks about the real need for what we call a Marshall Plan to deal with the massive ecological damage. And so we will have to do real-time reparations to the global south. Latin America, but particularly West Saharan Africa, will be very, very damaged by climate change. And we now know by 2100, 2150 that the Middle East will be too hot in the summer for people to live in.
Well, one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot, even in the immigration issue, we hear all this about scapegoating immigrants. But for instance, in the case of Syria, as an example, a lot of it has to do with drought, which is directly attributable to climate change. So there's not a lot of this discussion as to what is making people move. It isn't just because of economic, which it's mainly economic in many ways, but if you can't get water, or if it's hard to get water, I think you're going to migrate and go somewhere else.
Well, the Arab Spring in Egypt was over the price of wheat initially because Goldman Sachs had overinvested and the price had spiked up for that commodity, and that the inability to actually buy wheat, right, because it's subsidized by the Egyptian government, was one of the economic pulls, and that's climate change, right? So climate change is creating that instability.
But doesn't this bring us back to the original idea of utopia and politics? As utopia is a narrative for politics. So if we're living in a dystopic neoliberal era that is, in one sense, coming to an end, then utopian thinking should be looked at as innovative thinking for a new system. Because we have all the grim and disastrous history accumulating over time. So now it is time to think in terms of a utopian future so we can design a new system and do it as soon as possible because the current system, as they say, is broken. So this context of putting utopian thinking like that, I think, is probably more practical, ironically.
That's right.
It's not pie in the sky.
That's right, because that's where you can start creating policies and ideas, whether you're talking about governmental or whether you're talking about business. You have a lot of people in my network, and everybody's got their own particular idea of where you start. Well, it's kind of like when I talk to Dennis Kucinich, I think you just kind of start with everything. And that means economic discussion. That means social justice. That means environmental. And that's why Bernie Sanders was so popular, is because he laid it out as basically as you can, and then went issue by issue by issue initially when he started on the campaign trail, before he was forced to get into personality politics.
Right. I think back to your point that yes, utopian thinking is politically urgent. It's politically urgent.
It's actually revolutionary.
Yes.
Right.
Think about it. Ultimately.
Right. Well, we have to also know how to put it into words.
Right.
Well, that was what was so amazing about Bernie Sanders' campaign, is that he had this working class accent. He sounded like Brooklyn. He spoke directly. He didn't condescend.
Right.
He had a template that was very commonsensical, and he treated it as if it was common sense. I mean, that was the framing of what Bernie Sanders did so well. Say, look at the polling, look at my policies. Most of Europe already has this.
Right.
This is common sense there.
That's
We're
right.
not in common sense land.
That's right.
And so the framing of American politics as the delusional aspect of American society was brilliant, because he said, well, actually, what I'm advocating is kind of average in Europe.
That's right.
Yeah.
And those conversations people have at dinner tables or when they're doing dishes, is these stories about other countries doing things better than us. And I think the Utopian project is the only practical project, because we're in a dystopia that's pirouetting into an apocalypse. Right, so the only practical thing is now the revolutionary thing.
Right, and you're asking, well, where do we start?
Right.
And we'll start with everything. Start with everything.
Right.
And that's actually sort of true. Yeah. And this is how we've framed the intellectual outline of our project, and in a very intentional way, much like writing a book, that the introductory episodes to the podcast take a very sort of chapter-like approach to dive into deep systems thinking, because if there's any real indicative problem about the way that we think as collectively about politics and our engagement with the problems in the world, is that we engage and we think about surface level things.
Right.
We pay attention to the surface level injustices in our everyday life, that you offended me,
Right.
or that I offended you, right? And then we dialogue around those. But the way that the reason that we're in the dire circumstances that we are in as a species and as a planet are because of these deep structural systems.
Yeah.
And we really need to be able to talk about them when in clear, sensible, and visionary, revolutionary ways, if we're going to be able to address these problems in a meaningful way.
Well, starting with the environmental issue.
Yep.
Let's say we know that the technology exists. We can be transitioning to solar and wind and geothermal.
We could have done it 30 years ago.
We could have done it 30
35
years
ago.
So how do we get there? How do we do that? How do we make that impression on the general public, especially in the United States, to make that happen?
Well, I think for me, everyone has a different driver and mechanism, and one of the key problems with Occupy was that if it did have demands, it was like a 25-line list, a grocery list, and you have to narrow it down to 5 or 6, or in our case, we call it the Slingshot 7 policies that are part of a broad people's platform.
Right.
And so on our podcast, the Slingshot 7, we talk about how these 7 things don't cover everything, but they're enough that we can accomplish those tasks. Right. And by accomplishing those, we open the parachute of the possible. Right.
That's right.
So we don't have, like, for instance, end police brutality. We don't have,
well, we do really.
Demilitarization.
Demilitarization.
And some of them can be hubcapped under these larger terms. So, like, when we talk about ending the military-industrial complex, it includes police brutality as well as demilitarization of foreign affairs. And
so how do we do that? There's been proposals to cut the military budget in half. Is that a realistic proposal?
Not under the current system. And this is the problem with the electoral politics only focus, is, for me, in my mind, a 28th movement for a 20th Amendment to get out money from politics, private money, and create exclusive public financing. Now,
so how do we do that?
Norway has public financing. Norway has one of the cleanest democracies other than Denmark and New Zealand, and they have public financing. So anyone can run for office, and they all use the same funds.
Right. So
Yeah.
So how do we do any of these things?
Yeah.
Regardless of where we start, what the particular leverage point might be.
Because we want to create a world that looks left.
How do we actually do that? And what do we need to do tomorrow to start making that possible? Well, I think you mentioned the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Yes.
And we have talked before about the success of the Labour Party's campaign in UK earlier this year, when after Theresa May called the snap election in April, and Jeremy Corbyn was ready as the leader of the Labour Party to push forward a progressive platform, a comprehensive platform. Again, both Jeremy Corbyn's platform and Bernie Sanders are not radical, they're not necessarily utopian, they're even can be considered neoliberal to a certain degree, but they're a comprehensive set of values that are an articulation of what society ought to look like.
That's right, and Chris, they use taglines again. That's another thing from our marketing culture.
Right.
So they use like democratizing the economy, or the alternative models of ownership, and then those words themselves and the way they're put together, they get people to thinking about something different than the system that we have now.
And for the Labour Party, it was for the many, not the few.
Exactly.
So the interesting thing about the Labour Party is the left is horrible at marketing, right? The Democratic Party historically called the party of the complex sentence, and the right is called, the Republican Party is called the party of the compound sentence, right? And so the ability to phrase and market has been ingenious for neoliberalism, and the Republican Party just understands branding and terms. I mean, you saw the debate with Mike Pence. He talked about the cornfields of Iowa. They just have this way of massaging goop onto people. Right. But what's great about the manifesto was the Labor Manifesto, if you looked at it, was just designed better than the Tory manifesto.
That's right.
It was absolutely garbage. Actually, if you go to the Tory manifesto, Theresa May's face is stretched out like a banana.
Yeah, I know.
It's just like, what the hell?
They didn't even know how to format the
It looks like 1990s Photoshop. And so when you went to the Labour Party manifesto, it had a beautiful image of people, for the many, not the few, and then you could tap and it would open up into very simple folders, very legible, and not giant Bibles of description.
And it was readable. It was language that was accessible. Again, the quality of the appeal, broad appeal, and I think this is why these things we've seen the successes, because it engages a broad audience. And this is what we need to do in terms of deep systems and addressing deep systems problems and institutional problems. We need to be able to speak in ways that relate to people, and in ways that people can get passionate about.
Yeah, and I think the thing with what's really inspiring for people that were crushed, like I was, by Bernie Sanders' loss of the primary and the rigging wholesale by the Democratic Party for Hillary Clinton, was when Bernie Sanders called Jeremy Corbyn saying congratulations on the election, and he said, well, how did you do? Can you tell me? I mean, what was it that did it? And Jeremy Corbyn says, oh, we just followed your campaign. If that tells you anything, it says that we can leapfrog off of each other. Because remember, Margaret Thatcher came first, then Reagan.
That's right.
Blair, then Clinton. Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders is someone like Bernie Sanders. And so we should feel excited, actually, because we're seeing the effects of Bernie Sanders now in Britain. So we can build off that.
And part of the manifesto also includes some policies going back to a company prior to Thatcher coming into power. So they were borrowing some of those ideas that were shut down by the neoliberal movement and the trickle-down economics nonsense, which came even in this country with Ronald Reagan, which we are still, just like McCarthyism, we're still trapped in that nonsense. I wanted to show this real quick 30-second joke with comedian Jimmy Dore as part of this discussion. This is recently from the Americans for Democratic Action in Santa Monica. They had a fundraiser there with Jimmy Dore and Greg Palast, and this is a great joke. Let's watch that right now, and we'll talk.
It's so crazy that the United States has a conservative party that's in complete disarray, and the Republicans are falling apart too. Am I right? All right. Oh boy, I think the Democrats, they won't even Not only are they incapable of change, they won't even say the word single payer. They're so afraid to say single payer, it's like the Russians invented it. Hey, turns out Russia has it. Son of a bitch. Son of a bitch.
Okay, so basically, both parties are conservative. We have a two-party system, right? Democrats and Republicans, and even Gore Vidal, I think, identified it long ago. He said we have a one party, which is the property party, made up of two right wings.
And what David Harvey calls the Wall Street Party.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in both political parties.
Yeah.
We have one party that's conservative and one party that's racist.
That's a really good point. That's a very good point. And that should be the discussion that we're having about our political system right now. Yeah, absolutely.
What Trump was able to do, which is interesting, is bring the white supremacy component of the party together with the Wall Street libertarian, right libertarian component. So everyone thinks that he's an outlier. He was the only one that would ever be able to bring those two things together. And so actually he's a natural formation within the this white obsessed Republican Party, is that he was able to bring those two together. And so people are willing to follow along the lines. And Hillary thought, oh, the Republicans, moderates will vote for me. 9 out of 10 Republicans voted for Donald Trump. She didn't get the Republicans because they're very practical. They'll, okay, we'll take a bit of this neo-Nazi stuff, but we're going to get some tax credits from this.
That's right. And that's really what they're talking about. Because they want to. But then the Obama administration continued the Bush tax cuts so that they could create the political narrative that we don't have to borrow from China anymore.
Yes.
So, and then what does a businessman do? What does a successful capitalist businessman do when you have extra money? You know you're not having to pay an Eisenhower-era tax rate, and you can loan that money to the government. Interest. I'm going to make some money on this. See, and the American public doesn't realize how they get screwed in that way.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's happening, back to utopian thinking,
Yeah.
I think what we have is the failed utopia of the Demo-Republican capitalist parties.
Yeah.
And that is leading us into institutional crises right now. So the American dream has turned into the American nightmare.
Yeah.
And what happened last year in the election, I think, highlighted the major political crisis of legitimacy in the country.
Yeah.
The either-or fallacy, so to speak, is over with. So back to utopian thinking, where it's ironically practical to say, okay, these don't work. We need a new vision. We need new alternative institutions. So therefore, this is a good time to use utopian thinking to create new, effective public policies.
Right, right.
Because ironically, there's a contradiction in American consciousness. One of them is that, well, Americans are supposed to be forward-looking people. So the concept of utopianism means you look forward into the future and hopefully a better future. Okay? So the left has got to take that, okay, and move with that as a message to people.
We've got to also, the left has to also bring back, notions of freedom, right? Why do the Republican Party control notions of freedom? We talk about the building of cooperatives, community land trusts. That's freedom, right? That's economic freedom.
That's right.
Why does the universal have to be the province of the Republican Party, which gets to wrap themselves up in that, where the academic circles talk about the particularities of people? We have to bring back the universal as part of that.
I think when I think of in terms of solutions, I think like the New Deal was a short-term solution, and no long-term plan was put into place, and that was by design. Now we are going to learn from that mistake. And we're going to, we need short-term solutions. Universal basic income, as they're seeing in the pilot program in Finland, it's working. It's putting money in people's pockets right now so that they don't have to worry about getting their bills paid. They don't have to worry about getting food on the table. We're talking about basic necessities that everybody needs to survive. Now, the long term, it makes sense to me, is worker cooperatives where people still have to be educated about how to do this. And believe me, George and I have created Arete Media, along with some great people here that produced the intro you saw here on the show. And it's hard work. but it's relationship based, and that is where we have to start. We have to start about caring for one another, and not about the bottom line or the dollar bill. Or think about it. When you take a dollar bill out of your pocket, you've probably been handled by who knows how many people. It's a dirty piece of paper. You got to wash your hands, really.
Well, it's dirty in many, many ways.
In many, many ways. I mean,
it's a bloody piece of paper.
It's a bloody piece of paper. So let's, unfortunately, start to wind this down a little bit.
I think the main thing is that capitalism's built on deception and deceit and ripping each other off, and that we have to move in a utopian fashion to an economic system based on love and solidarity. So it takes hard work to have a co-op, but it's built on love, and it builds from love.
That's right.
Well, I think that the whole idea from a structural point of view is that we have to start changing our entire political, social, economic consciousness towards this. And now, again, back to utopian thinking, and ironically making it practical thinking, that yes, we can change the way we look at each other, our relationships. We have to bring politics back, democracy back into the workplace, into life, to repoliticize people, because what has happened over the decades is that we've detached people from governance, from politics, and they become spectators.
And just spectators instead of participants in the entire system across the spectrum, whether it's where you work, where you live, how you vote, or if you vote, all of that. There isn't one part of society where there should not be participation.
And I'm optimistic given the activities and voice, the rising voice of the millennial generation.
Yes.
Having
and the Zers.
And the Zers.
Zennials,
But specifically having the experiences that they have had of rising tuition costs and mounting debt, and the inability to find meaningful and well-paying work so that they can pay off that debt. Endless wars, unjustified wars, and a sort of dizzying array of lies that they see on the news every day. So I am heartened by the growth of organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, which has gone from 8,000 members last year to over 25,000 members this year.
That's right.
And I am heartened by the voices that are standing up against neo-Nazis and white supremacy.
Absolutely.
Both last weekend in response to the events in Charlottesville, Virginia, and this today as we record this in Boston. And that they are seeing that these things are evidence of the faulty design, the institutional failures, right? That this world is poorly designed, and that we have to come up with a better vision for the world and work to get there.
Yeah, what happened in Charlottesville is a very good example of the Antifa movement, the anti-fascist movement, a generation actually not being spectators. They stood up and said, we've had enough of this. And so they're essentially fighting against a system that's in decay, the famous saying that capitalism in decay turns into fascism.
That's right. And that's one of those areas, it's like war. When I was a peace activist, you have to be anti-war, anti-fascism. I mean, we have to have a strong position there. We're going to have to wrap this up, so some final thoughts?
Yeah, like I said, I am around millennials all the time, and the crucial thing that gives me optimism is not just their sense of solidarity with each other, but their rage at the unfair deal they've been given.
That's right. Well, we have to go, but we're going to have to continue this conversation another time. It's fantastic. Thank you, Matt Snyder and Jesse Herring from the Future Is A Mixtape podcast, and also political analyst Professor George Kallas. This is Niswander, and until next time, be present always.